Imagine walking down the street, minding your business, when suddenly, two officers stop you, not to ask for help, not to check on you, but to demand you shine their shoes. That's exactly what happened to one man, except these cops had no idea who they were talking to. Dressed in a simple suit, he didn't look like anyone special. Just another guy, right? Wrong. The man they tried to humiliate wasn't just anyone, he was the state's highest-ranking judge. At first he stayed quiet, watching as they smirked, waiting for him to obey. But instead of reaching for a shoe brush, he reached for something else, his words, his power, and his position. And that's when everything changed. What happens next? How do the officers react when they realize their mistake? Stay tuned, because this is one story they'll never forget, and neither will you. The judge stood still, his face calm, but his mind racing. He had spent years fighting for justice, ensuring the law was upheld fairly. Yet here he was, being treated like nothing, like he didn't matter. The officers, still unaware of who they were dealing with, exchanged amused glances. One of them nudged his partner and said, "What's the holdup? You got a job to do." The man took a deep breath. He could have snapped, could have revealed his title right then and there. But instead, he wanted to see how far they would go. Would they threaten him? Would they push him? He had seen men like them before, officers who wore their badges like armor, but used them as weapons. People walking by stole glances but said nothing, too afraid to interfere. The tension in the air was thick, and then the judge finally spoke. But what he said next would change everything. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The officers exchanged a quick look, confused for a moment. Then one of them scoffed. "Yeah, I'm sure. I gave you an order." His tone was sharper now, impatient. The judge didn't move. He just studied them, as if measuring their next move. The street felt quieter, as if the world was holding its breath. A few people had stopped, sensing something unusual about this exchange. The officers, however, were still oblivious. To them, he was just another man refusing to obey. One officer stepped closer, his stance tightening. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be," he warned. The judge remained calm, but inside, something burned. He had spent his life upholding the law, yet here he was, facing the very abuse he had fought against. But he wasn't done yet, not even close. The officer took another step closer, his hand twitching as if ready to take control. "I won't ask again," he said, his voice low and threatening. The judge met his eyes, unshaken. He could feel the moment stretching, the weight of it pressing down. Every second that passed, the situation grew more dangerous. Not for him, but for them. A small crowd had gathered now, people whispering, their eyes darting between the judge and the officers. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just," he started, but his partner cut him off with a sharp look. He wasn't backing down. The judge took a step forward, just enough to make the officer hesitate. "I'll give you one chance," the judge said, his voice even. "Think carefully about what you do next." The officer smirked, but that confidence wouldn't last. The moment of truth was coming, and when it did, everything would change. The officer narrowed his eyes, his smirk fading just slightly. Something about the judge's confidence unsettled him, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Oh yeah," he scoffed. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Before the judge could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." A commanding presence stepped forward, a senior officer, drawn by the murmurs of the crowd and the raised voices. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in the frozen moment. The two officers, the judge, the onlookers with phones in hand. Something wasn't right. "Sir, we were just handling a situation," the first officer started, but the senior officer held up a hand. Then his gaze landed on the judge, and recognition flickered across his face. His expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "Wait," he said slowly, almost in disbelief. "You're Judge Williams." The air grew heavier. The officers stiffened. And in that moment, they realized they had made a mistake they couldn't take back. The color drained from the officers' faces. Judge Williams, the same man who had ruled on some of the most important cases in the state, the same man who had the power to hold them accountable. The first officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His partner took a small step back, suddenly unsure of everything. The senior officer's jaw tightened. He turned to the judge, his voice lower now, more cautious. "Your Honor, I apologize for any misunderstanding." Judge Williams remained still, his expression unreadable. The crowd was silent, waiting, watching. He could have called for their suspension right then and there. He could have ended their careers in an instant, but instead, he simply took a deep breath and said, "A misunderstanding, or a pattern." The officers looked down, realizing there was no excuse, no way to undo what had already been done. And then Judge Williams turned to the crowd, locking eyes with the people who had witnessed it all. "This," he said, "is why the law must be upheld fairly for everyone." But just as the officers thought the worst was over, the judge reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had been recording the entire time. The officers stared at a phone in Judge Williams' hand, their confidence completely gone. They had assumed they were in control, but now the power had shifted. The senior officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Your Honor, let's talk about this," he said carefully. Judge Williams studied them for a moment before slipping his phone back into his pocket. "The way you treat people when you think no one is watching, that's who you really are," he said. "I don't need to ruin your careers. You've already done that yourselves." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the officers standing there, exposed. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the moment wouldn't be forgotten. By the next day, the story had spread. A reminder that justice isn't about titles or uniforms, it's about actions. And for those two officers, one thing was clear. They had just learned a lesson they would never forget.